Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some really challenging but absolutely vital material you've shared with us today.
That's right.
We're going to be looking closely at the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It's incredibly complex, incredibly urgent right now.
Yeah, and our plan for this deep dive is really to, unpack the key insights from this material. We want to get a handle on the timeline, look at the global reactions. Basically, try to give you a clearer picture without getting lost in, well, all the noise.
Absolutely. And we should probably start where the material does with this really stark warning. It came on May 7th, 2025, from a UN panel of experts.
Yeah, that wording was striking.
It really was. They said the situation was, quote, flirting with extermination. And they called it, this is powerful language, an ostentatious and merciless manifestation of the destruction of human life and dignity.
Wow. That language, it signals something incredibly serious, something the world is seeing, perhaps, but maybe not fully grasping the sheer depth of it.
Right. So to understand how we got here, maybe let's set the scene a bit. Gaza itself.
It's tiny, a really small strip of land, but incredibly densely populated. We're talking over 2 million people crammed into an area smaller than many cities.
Okay, and the event that triggered this latest catastrophic phase, the sources point back to October 7th, 2023.
That's the Hamas attack on southern Israel. The material notes 1,200 people killed, mostly civilians, and 251 hostages taken. That event, it fundamentally shifted Israel's approach.
Leading to the military campaign in Gaza.
Exactly. And the scale of the impact since then, it's just staggering. The sources cite Gaza's health ministry figures over 52,000 Palestinians dead.
And it's important, as the sources note, that this ministry doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians in its count.
Right. And beyond the terrible loss of life, there's the destruction. Homes, hospitals, schools, just widespread devastation.
So that sets the stage from late 2023. But the material makes it clear things have gotten even worse as we moved into 2025.
They really have. There was a brief ceasefire, remember, January 19th to March 18th, 2025.
A small window.
A very small window. And then it collapsed. Israel resumed its offensive.
The stated aim being to dismantle Hamas. But the sources highlight that the campaign continued hitting civilian infrastructure hard. Homes, schools, even community kitchens.
Vital services, yeah. And there's that grim statistic from Gaza's health ministry again. May 20th, 2025, just one day, at least 85 Palestinians killed.
Which brings us right into the heart of the current humanitarian crisis, the blockade, the aid challenges. This seems to be a major focus in the material.
Absolutely devastating is the word. Since March 2nd, 2025, the sources say supply lines into Gaza have just been choked off.
Not just limited, but like almost completely blocked.
Pretty much. Food, medicine, fuel, the essentials are just not getting through in anything like the quantities needed.
And the UN's warning on this?
Stark. They warned that 2 million people are at imminent risk of starvation because of this. It's terrifying.
We did see, I think it was May 19th, Israel allowed some aid in, but it was described as minimal. Minimal is the key word. A few dozen trucks, apparently. Compare that to the 600 trucks a day getting in during that brief ceasefire earlier in the year.
It's a massive difference, just night and day.
Huge. And even the tiny amount that does get across the border, getting it to people inside Gaza is another nightmare.
Why is that so difficult?
Well, the sources describe these Israeli military rules. Complex procedures for unloading aid, then reloading it onto different trucks. The UN calls the whole process long, complex, complicated, and dangerous.
So logistical hurdles on top of everything else.
Exactly. And it leads to chaos. You read about desperate Gazans storming warehouses, armed groups looting supplies.
There's that analogy in the sources, wasn't there? Like trying to fix world hunger with one sandwich.
And then someone steals the bread. Yeah. It perfectly captures the futility, the desperation, and how the aid itself becomes a point of conflict because the system to manage it has just collapsed.
It's not just getting it to the border, it's the whole internal distribution network falling apart completely. And beyond food, the medical situation is just as dire. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, warned on May 2nd that the whole humanitarian response system is on the verge of total collapse.
What does that look like on the ground?
Hospitals shutting down, no medical supplies. We saw that awful detail. Children with severe burns, but no pain medication available.
Just unimaginable suffering.
Yeah. And there was that quote from a Doctors Without Borders coordinator describing mothers literally watching their children starve, calling it an agony.
Yeah. So faced with this level of absolute crisis, what has the world's reaction been? The material suggests it's Complicated.
A real mixed bag, definitely. You see genuine expressions of concern. Pope Leo IV, the new pope, apparently made a heartfelt plea saying he was deeply hurt.
And Italy's foreign minister, Tajani.
Quite blunt, actually. On May 17th, telling Israel enough with the attacks.
We also saw mentions of public protest.
Significant protests, like over 100,000 people marching in The Hague on May 18th. And the sources mentioned one protester, Rick Timmermans, pointing specifically to the Dutch government supplying F-35 parts to Israel. So it brings in that layer of national politics, too.
But then you look at the major powers, the U.S., UK, Germany. What's their stance, according to the material?
Well, they've continued to publicly back Israel's right to defend itself, even with the rising death toll and, the scrutiny from international courts.
Which is interesting because the material also highlights criticism from within Israel itself.
Yeah, that's quite striking. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, quoted on May 21st, called Israel's actions very close to a war crime. And he called Netanyahu's campaign a war without a purpose. That's a pretty powerful critique from a former leader.
And then there's President Trump's perspective. Back in office, according to these sources.
Right. He's voiced support for the offensive, but also made that suggestion about resettling Gazans elsewhere to turn the Strip into a Middle East Riviera.
Which, as the sources note, immediately raised fears of another Nakba.
Exactly. That 1948 displacement of Palestinians. It's a deeply resonant historical trauma. And meanwhile, the UN is clear. Forced displacement is a war crime under international law. So you see these totally conflicting narratives and positions being reported globally.
And throughout all this, we can't lose sight of Hamas's role, which the sources keep bringing up. The October 7th attack, the hostages.
Absolutely critical context. They're still holding hostages, the material suggests, around 24 now, down from 251, but sadly, few are believed to still be alive.
And their demands.
They're a major sticking point. Hamas refuses to release the hostages without a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire deal.
Which puts immense pressure on Netanyahu back in Israel.
From hostage families, definitely. Yeah. And even reportedly from some Israeli reservists who are saying, prioritize getting the hostages home over the military goals.
So it sounds like a complete stalemate.
That's what the sources describe. Both sides deeply entrenched, seemingly irreconcilable positions. And civilians caught in the middle, paying this horrific price.
We also saw mention of Israel's plans to, quote, seize control inside Gaza and manage aid distribution themselves.
Yeah, but aid groups are really worried about that. They see it as potentially violating those core humanitarian principles, neutrality, independence.
Which are vital for them to actually operate and reach people.
Crucial. If they're seen as taking sides or being controlled by one party to the conflict, it undermines their ability to work safely and effectively.
There was also that new U.S.-backed group mentioned, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, aiming for 300 million meals.
Right, but then there was that incident reported on May 27th. Their aid center in Rafah just got overrun by desperate crowds. It just highlights the impossible conditions, the sheer scale of the need.
So bringing this all together, why does this situation, this crisis in Gaza, matter beyond the immediate tragedy? How do the sources connect it to, to us, to you listening?
They frame it very powerfully, actually, as a kind of mirror, reflecting how the world deals with justice, with humanity, with accountability.
The UN's phrase was a defining moral crossroads.
Exactly. It's presented as a test for international law, for human rights principles, for that whole never again promise.
And the consequences if we collectively fail this test.
The sources warn about apathy setting in, about accepting that we just turn away when things get too complex or too grim.
And there are tangible effects too, right? Not just moral ones. The economic ripple effects.
Yeah, the material reminds us that back in 2023, experts were already warning that conflicts like this could spike energy prices, mess up trade routes, fuel inflation globally.
And now, in 2025, are we seeing that happen?
Absolutely. The sources point to exactly that. Jitters in oil prices, ongoing supply chain issues. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has global growth pegged at a pretty sluggish 2.9%. These things are connected.
And the risk of it getting even worse.
There's the constant danger of escalation, a wider regional conflict. If that happened, the sources warn we'd all likely feel it, maybe most obviously at the gas pump.
Okay, so after laying out this incredibly bleak picture, do the sources offer any sense of a path forward? Any solutions?
Well, they're pretty clear there are no easy answers here. The lack of them is sort of the point.
The ceasefire seems like the biggest immediate hurdle.
Definitely. Both sides described as just too dug in with fundamentally opposing goals. Israel wants Hamas gone, Hamas wants Israel out. It's hard to see the middle ground right now.
And the aid situation.
The gap is just enormous. The UN says 600 trucks a day could stabilize things, but they're getting, what, around 100? Maybe? That difference is catastrophic.
We also saw the mention of the International Court of Justice case.
Right. The case brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide. It's moving through the ICJ, the UN's main court. But these legal processes, while important for accountability down the line, are very slow. They don't solve the immediate crisis.
So the pressure really falls on them.
The sources seem to suggest it falls heavily on the major international players, the US, the EU, to find ways to exert real pressure on both sides, to push them towards de-escalation, towards prioritizing civilian life and aid access. But how effective that pressure can be, that's the open question.
Ultimately, it seems the material keeps coming back to this idea of Gaza as more than just a place. It's a test.
A profound test, yeah, of our collective humanity, our willingness to act when things are difficult. And frankly, the sources suggest we're not exactly acing that test right now.
It really forces you to reflect on everything we've just unpacked.
It does. It's not about finding simple answers, because the sources make it obvious there aren't any right now. It's about grappling with the complexity, the history, and the devastating human cost.
So maybe the thought we should leave you with, drawn from all this, is this. When we see suffering on this scale, how do we make sure humanity is more than just a word we use? How do we stop our collective conscience from just flatlining? And maybe ask ourselves, what responsibility does bearing witness to this actually place on us?